According to Purdue University's online writing lab, plagiarism is the uncredited use, both intentional and unintentional, of somebody else's words or ideas. Welcome to What is Plagiarism? To view this program, first adjust your volume, and second, pull out a notepad and be ready to take notes. Follow along with the Plagiarism Workshop question sheet, and after this presentation, you will understand what is plagiarism. Many people think of plagiarism as copying another's work or borrowing someone else's original ideas. But terms like copying and borrowing can disguise the seriousness of the offense. According to Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary, to plagiarize means to steal and pass off the ideas or words of another as one's own. To use another's production without crediting the source. To commit literary theft. And to present as new and original an idea or product derived from an existing source. In other words, plagiarism is an act of fraud. It involves both stealing someone else's work and lying about it afterward. All of the following are considered examples of plagiarism: turning in someone else's work as your own, copying words or ideas from someone else without giving credit, failing to put a quotation in quotation marks, giving incorrect information about the source of a quotation, changing words but copying the sentence structure of a source without giving credit, and copying so many words or ideas from a source that it makes up the majority of your work, whether you give credit or not. Changing the words of an original source is not sufficient to prevent plagiarism. If you have retained the essential idea of an original source and have not cited it, then no matter how drastically you may have altered its context or presentation, you have still plagiarized. Most cases of plagiarism can be avoided, however, by citing sources. Simply are all published works copyrighted? Well, no. And here's why. The Copyright Act only protects works that express original ideas or information. For example, you could borrow liberally from these following items without fear of plagiarism. Got a phone book? How about works published by the government? You know, those .gov items. How about facts that are not part of the original research, like there are 50 US states, or carrots contain vitamin A, or works that are in the public domain, but that's only if you cite properly. Can facts be copyrighted? Yes, in some situations. Facts that have been published as a result of individual research are considered the intellectual property of the author. Now, wait a second. You got me confused. Do I have to cite sources for every fact I use? No, you do not have to cite sources for facts that are not the result of unique individual research. Facts that are readily available from numerous sources and generally known to the public are considered common knowledge and are not protected by copyright laws. If you are unsure whether or not a fact is common knowledge, you should probably cite your source just to be safe. If I plagiarize, could I end up in jail? Well, here is a little bit about some of the punishments. As with any wrongdoing, the degree of intent and the nature of the offense determines its status. When plagiarism takes place in an academic setting, it is most often handled by the individual instructors and the academic institution involved. If, however, the plagiarism involves money, prizes, or job placement, it constitutes a crime punishable in court. Most colleges and universities have zero tolerance for plagiarists. In fact, academic standards of intellectual honesty are often more demanding than governmental copyright laws. A plagiarized paper almost always results in failure for the assignment, frequently in failure for the course, and sometimes in expulsion. Most cases of plagiarism, though, are considered misdemeanors, punishable by fines of anywhere between $100 and $50,000 and up to 1 year in jail. Plagiarism can also be considered a felony under certain state and federal laws. For example, if a plagiarist copies and earns more than $2,500 from copyrighted material, he or she may face up to $250,000 in fines and up to 10 years in jail. And most corporations and institutions will not tolerate any form of plagiarism. There have been a significant number of cases around the world where people have lost their jobs or been denied positions as a result of plagiarism. Ignorance of the law is never an excuse. So even if you did not realize you were plagiarizing, you may still be found guilty. However, there are different punishments for willful infringement or deliberate plagiarism and innocent infringement or accidental plagiarism. To distinguish between these, courts recognize what is called the good faith defense. If you can demonstrate based on the amount you borrowed and the way you have incorporated it in your own work that reasonably believed what you did was fair use, chances are that your sentence will be lessened substantially. But what is fair use? The United States government has established guidelines for determining the nature and amount of work that may be borrowed without explicit written consent. These are called the fair use laws because they try to establish whether certain uses of original material are reasonable. The laws themselves are vague and complicated. Here are some rubrics you can apply to help determine the fairness of any given usage. First, the nature of your use. If you have merely copied something, it is unlikely to be considered fair use. But if the material has been transformed in an original way through interpretation, analysis, etc., it is more likely to be considered fair use. Next, the amount you've used. The more you've borrowed, the less likely it is to be considered fair use. What percentage of your work is borrowed material? What percent of the original did you use? The lower, the better. And last, the effect of your use on the original. If you're creating a work that competes with the original in its own market and may do the original author economic harm, any substantial borrowing is unlikely to be considered fair use. The more the content of your work or its target audience differs from that of the original, the better. Works that are no longer protected by copyright, or never have been, are considered public domain. This means that you may freely borrow material from these works without fear of plagiarism, provided you make the proper attributions. The terms and conditions under which works enter the public domain are a bit complicated. In general, anything published more than 75 years ago is now in the public domain. If the work was published after 1978, these are protected for the lifetime of the author plus 70 more years. The laws governing works published fewer than 75 years ago but before 1978 are a bit more complicated. Although generally copyright protection extends 28 years after publication, plus 47 more years if the copyright was renewed. This totals 75 years from the publication date. If you're uncertain about whether or not a work is in the public domain, it's probably best to contact a lawyer or act under the assumption that it is still protected by copyright law. Copyright law allows portions of a copyrighted work to be used without the author's permission for specific purposes. This is referred to as fair use. It allows for portions, or in some cases the entirety of a copyrighted work, to be used for different purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, including multiple copies for classroom use, scholarship, or research. But remember, in the end, we'll take a look at the purpose, the nature, the amount, and the effect that that work has on its original source. And always remember, when in doubt, cite the source. These folks think they have an idea on what is citation. Here's a better explanation. A citation is the way you tell your readers that certain material in your work came from somewhere else. It gives us the information about the author, the title of the work, the name and location of the company that published your copy of the source, the date your copy was published, and the page numbers of the material you are borrowing. When you've written that great essay or research paper and your reader is just dying to find out more, a citation gives your reader the information necessary to find that source again. So, why should I cite? Giving credit to the original author by citing sources is the only way to use other people's work without plagiarizing. But there are a number of other reasons to cite sources. Citations are extremely helpful to anyone who wants to find out more about your ideas and where they came from. Not all sources are good or right. Your own ideas may often be more accurate or interesting than those of your sources. Proper citation will keep you from taking the rap for someone else's bad ideas. Citing sources shows the amount of research that you've done. You've worked hard. Citing sources strengthens your work by lending outside support to your ideas. Doesn't citing sources make my work seem less original? Oh, how contraire. Not at all. Citing sources actually helps your reader distinguish your ideas from those of your sources. This will actually emphasize the originality of your own work. When do I need to cite? Well, the answer is quite simple. Whenever you borrow words or ideas, you need to acknowledge their source. You need to cite whenever you use quotes, whenever you paraphrase, whenever you use an idea that someone else has already expressed, whenever you make specific reference to the work of another, and whenever someone else's work has been critical in developing your own ideas. How do I cite sources? This depends on what type of work you are writing, how you are using the borrowed material, and the expectations of your instructor. First, you have to think about how you want to identify your sources. Is it a major point or a minor point? If your sources are very important to your ideas, then mention the author in a work in a sentence that includes your citation. If, however, you're only citing the source to make a minor point, then you might want to consider something like a parenthetical reference, a footnote, or an endnote. There are different forms of citation for different disciplines. For example, when you cite sources in a psychology or science paper, you might probably use a different form of citation called APA than you might use in a paper for an English class, which typically uses the MLA format. Finally, you should always consult your instructor to determine the form of citation appropriate for your paper. You can save a lot of time, energy, and frustration simply by asking, how should I cite my sources, or what style of citation should I use before you begin writing? A great place to find more information is at the OWL, the Purdue Online Writing Lab. What is quoting? Taking the exact words from original source is called quoting. You should quote material when you believe the way the original author expresses an idea is the most effective means of communicating the point you want to make. If you want to borrow an idea from an author but do not need his or her exact words, you should try paraphrasing instead of quoting. Remember, quote as infrequently as possible. You never want your essay to become a series of connected quotes because that leaves little room for your ideas. Now that I've used quotes and paraphrases in my paper, how do I make my reader aware of where to find more information? Easy. Use a listing for your references. Which one do I need for my research? Well, there are a couple different ones that you commonly hear: bibliography, annotated bibliography, works cited, and works consulted. A bibliography is a list of all the sources you have used in the process of researching your work. In general, a bibliography should include the author's names, the titles of the works, the names and locations of the companies that publish your copies of the sources, the dates your copies were published, relevant page numbers, or website addresses. Different kinds of sources, such as magazine articles and chapters in a multi-author volumes, require more specific information. So that's a bibliography. What's an annotated bibliography? Well, it's the same as a bibliography, but there's one important difference. In an annotated bibliography, the bibliographic information is followed by a brief description of the content, quality, and usefulness of the sources. What are works cited and work consulted pages? How are they different? Well, sometimes you may be asked to include these, especially if you used a parenthetical style of citation. A works cited page is a list of all the works from which you have borrowed your material. Your reader may find this more convenient than footnotes or endnotes because he or she will not have to wade through all the comments and other information in order to see the sources from which you drew your material. A works consulted page is a complement to a works cited page, and that lists all of the works you used, whether they were useful or not. Okay, you just threw in another new term. What is this parenthetical style? Well, sometimes it's called the author date style or the in-text style, but it's a reference to sources which are made in the body of the work itself through parentheses. Here's an example of what one would look like if you took the following sentence from page 23 of a book written by Professor Scott in 1999. This is generally considered an abbreviated form of citation, and it does not require footnotes or endnotes. If you are concerned about plagiarism and preventing it, I recommend that you use this checklist. First, consult with your instructor. You have questions? If you can't find the answers on your own or are unsure about something, you should ask your instructor. He or she will most likely be very happy to answer your questions. Plan your paper. Planning your paper well is the first and most important step you can take toward preventing plagiarism. If you know you are going to use other sources of information, you need to plan how you are going to include them in your paper. Take effective notes. One of the best ways to prepare for a research paper is by taking thorough notes from all of your sources so that you have much of the information organized before you begin writing. On the other hand, poor note-taking can lead to many problems, including improper citation and misquotations, both of which are forms of plagiarism. When in doubt, cite sources. Of course you want to get credit for your own ideas, and you don't want your instructor to think that you got all of your information from somewhere else. But if it is unclear whether an idea in your paper really came from you or whether you got it from somewhere else and just changed it a little, You should always cite your source. Make it clear who said what. Even if you cite sources, ambiguity, which is that sense of vagueness or unclearness, in your phrasing can often disguise the real source of any given idea, causing inadvertent plagiarism. Make certain when you mix your own ideas with those of your sources that you always clearly distinguish them. If you are discussing the ideas of more than one person, watch out for confusing pronouns. For example, imagine you're talking about Harold Bloom's discussion of James Joyce's opinion of Shakespeare, and you write, "He brilliantly portrayed the situation of a writer in society at that time." Who is the he in this sentence? Is it Bloom, Joyce, or Shakespeare? Who is the writer? Is it Joyce, Shakespeare, or one of their characters? Always make certain to distinguish who said what and give credit to the right person. Know how to paraphrase. A paraphrase is a restatement in your own words of someone else's ideas. Changing a few words of the original sentences does not make your writing a legitimate paraphrase. You must change both the words and the sentence structure of the original without changing the content. Also, you should keep in mind that paraphrased passages still require citation because the ideas came from another source, even though you are putting them in your own words. The purpose of paraphrasing is not to make it seem like you are drawing less directly from other sources or to reduce the number of quotations in your paper. Actually, it is advantageous to highlight the fact that other sources support your ideas. Using quality sources to support your ideas make them seem stronger and more valid. And finally, evaluate your sources. Not all sources on the web are worth citing. In fact, many of them are just plain wrong. Make sure you know the authors of the page, where they got their information, and when they wrote it. Getting this information is also an important step in avoiding plagiarism. Just like hacking into websites, plagiarizing papers can be something of a thrill in itself. For many students, it becomes a question of ingenuity. Can I sneak a plagiarized paper past my professor? But there is usually more behind intentional plagiarism than just the thrill of deception. One way students plagiarize is searching versus researching. Anyone with some basic knowledge can find information on the internet. It's what they do with the information that's important. But their words are better. Teachers and readers want to know most is seeing how you understand your topic and how you develop your own style and voice. Making the grade. Students are under an enormous amount of pressure from family, peers, and instructors to compete for scholarships, admission, and of course places in the job market. Students tend to focus on the end results of their research rather than the skills they learn in doing it. Everyone else is doing it. Students often justify plagiarism by pointing out that since their peers plagiarize, they must do the same to keep up. My dad used to say, "Son, if your friends were jumping off the bridge, are you going to jump as well?" Poor planning. Students are not always the best judges of how much time their assignments will take. They may not be aware of the extent of work involved in a research paper, or may simply be overwhelmed by the task and put it off until the last minute, leaving them with no time for original work of their own. This is why it's so important to be in consultation with your teacher. No honest student would walk out of a neighbor's house accidentally carrying their television, but even the most well intentioned writers sometimes appropriate the work of others without proper authority. How does this unintentional plagiarism occur? First, citation confusion. Perhaps the most common reason for inadvertent plagiarism is simply an ignorance of the proper forms of citation. Plagiarism versus paraphrasing. Many students have trouble knowing when they are paraphrasing and when they are plagiarizing. In an effort to make their work seem more original by putting things in their own words, students may often inadvertently plagiarizing by changing the original too much or sometimes not enough. I was just copying my notes. Students often mix their own ideas and those of their sources when they take sloppy notes, creating confusion when they begin the writing process. I couldn't find the source. Students are often sloppy about writing down the bibliographic information of their sources, leaving them unable to properly attribute information when it comes to writing the paper. It is important to keep careful track of references during the note-taking stage. I thought we didn't have to quote facts. Because the internet makes information so readily available, students may find it difficult to tell the difference between common knowledge they are free to use and original ideas which are the intellectual property of others. Remember this: when in doubt, cite sources. And confusion about expectations. One of the most common sources of confusion is the ambiguity or vagueness or lack of clarity of terms such as analyze and discuss. These words have specific meanings in academic discourse, and they imply a degree of original thought that goes beyond more reporting. Tell me more. Prove your point. Compare the material. Put it into your own words. What is the real cost of plagiarism? Singer-songwriter Michael Bolton enjoyed much popular success in the 80s and 90s. Renowned for soulful remakes of Motown classics like When a Man Loves a Woman and Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, Bolton's legacy is nonetheless tainted with the stigma of plagiarism. In 2000, the Ninth Circuit Court upheld an earlier verdict that Bolton's 1991 song, Love is a Wonderful Thing, was too similar to the 1964 Isley Brothers song, Love is a Wonderful Thing. Bolton had sold more than 10 million copies of the recording worldwide. As a result of the ruling, the jury awarded the original artists, the Isley Brothers, $5.4 million for copyright infringement. This remains the largest payout for copyright infringement in the music industry. Okay, $5.4 million is a lot of money, but when students plagiarize, what is the real cost? It's more than the loss of credit or possible expulsion. It is the loss of your integrity and self-respect, and there is no price that you can put on that. Let's recap what we learned today. What is plagiarism? while plagiarism is the stealing and passing off the ideas or words of another as one's own. It is the use of another's production without crediting the source. It is committing literary theft. It's presenting as new and original an idea or product derived from an existing source. Plagiarism is an act of fraud and is both stealing someone else's work and lying about it afterwards. Last but not least, remember, when in doubt, ask. In Hamlet, Prince of Denmark by William Shakespeare, the character Polonius in Act 1, Scene 3 says it best when it comes to borrowing. Neither a borrower nor a lender be, for loan oft loses both itself and friend, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. Remember to be true to yourself.